The transport ship shuddered violently as it cut through the thick, acrid atmosphere of a planet that had long been a symbol of danger. The Deathworlders, as they were known, had earned their reputation across the galaxy. Even the bravest and most seasoned explorers hesitated to step foot on their home planet, where every corner harbored a creature that could kill with a single glance. A species that thrived in a brutal ecosystem where the laws of nature were as savage as the creatures themselves. But today, the crew wasn't just on a routine mission. Today, they were tasked with something even more extraordinary, observing and studying the youngest of the Deathworlder species, Toddlers. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Lieutenant Garth's voice echoed through the ship's cramped cockpit as he adjusted the navigation controls. His brows furrowed in deep concern. "I've read the reports, and frankly, I'm not sure humanity's going to survive this one." His partner, Captain Lena Everhart, sat across from him, a look of quiet determination in her eyes. She had always been the one who saw things through, no matter how dangerous. But today, even she couldn't shake the unease gnawing at the back of her mind. "The higher-ups think this is important, Garth. If we can make it through this, we might unlock the secret to the Deathworlders' resilience. We're not just going to study them, we're going to learn how they survive." The ship jerked again, pulling Garth out of his thoughts. "If we survive, that is." The crew had been briefed on the mission in the highest secrecy. The Federation had sent a small group of the most experienced officers to the Deathworld, with one singular objective: observe and gather information about Deathworlder toddlers. This was a rare opportunity, one that had only become possible through a shift in the Deathworlders' behavior toward the Federation. The normally hostile species had started to exhibit curious behavior when it came to their young, especially the toddlers. Previously, attempts to approach or observe them had resulted in swift, violent retaliation. But something had changed, and the Federation wanted to know why. As they prepared to land, the planet's surface began to reveal its treacherous terrain. The dark skies above them were streaked with strange, vibrant lightning, while the land below shifted constantly. The ground was alive, literally, writhing with the movement of millions of predators. Each blade of grass, each rock, could potentially be a threat. "Hold on tight, we're about to land." Captain Everhart's voice was steady, but Garth couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to step into a situation far beyond their control. The ship descended, shaking violently as it struggled against the planet's unforgiving winds. It was clear that the Death World had no intention of making things easy. The crew could feel the ship's metal frame groaning under the pressure, but Everhart's steady hands ensured a smooth enough landing on the rocky plateau where they would meet their guide, an unusually courageous, or perhaps foolish, Deathworlder who had agreed to help them. The moment the ship's ramp lowered, the stench of the planet's life force filled the air. It wasn't just a scent, it was a feeling, an oppressive, primal force that weighed down on every inch of their bodies. The planet's ecosystems were so alive, so lethal, that even the air seemed to carry a threat. But there was something else too, something subtle, in the undercurrent of the atmosphere. The toddlers, the heart of the mission, were waiting somewhere within this maze of deadly flora and fauna. It was said that Deathworlder young were more dangerous than fully grown predators on many planets, their reflexes honed from birth, their instincts set to a level that humans couldn't begin to comprehend. And now, for the first time in history, the crew would observe them up close. Lieutenant Garth tightened his grip on his sidearm as they stepped out onto the rocky surface. His heart was racing, not just because of the danger, but because he felt like an intruder, an alien on a world that was never meant to accommodate him. The otherworldly creatures that scurried around them seemed to watch with intelligent eyes, as though assessing their every move. "We have to stick to the path," Captain Everhart commanded, her voice steady as they moved forward, navigating the uneven landscape. "We meet our guide, then we find the toddlers." Their guide was a Deathworlder, large, towering, and imposing, with thick, rippling muscles that seemed almost unnatural. His skin was a muted shade of green, and his eyes, black as midnight, seemed to pierce through the group. His name was Gyrith, and though the Federation had little understanding of his species' language, they'd learned to communicate through rudimentary signs. Gyrith motioned for the group to follow him, leading them through a jagged canyon that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. The air here was thick, hot, and filled with a constant hum, a sound that resonated deep within the chest. As they moved forward, Everhard couldn't help but notice how the ground shifted beneath their feet, alive in its own right, subtly shifting and twisting like a living organism. It was as if the planet itself was judging their every step, testing their worthiness to proceed. But it wasn't just the terrain they had to watch out for. Strange creatures lurked in the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly, waiting for any sign of weakness. The world they had landed on was a labyrinth of life and death, each corner hiding a new challenge, a new predator that could easily tear them apart. Gyras stopped suddenly, motioning for the group to stay still. His eyes scanned the horizon, and for a moment, the air was thick with tension. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, he pointed to a small group in the distance. It wasn't what they expected to see, not towering predators or massive beasts, but something far more unnerving. There, in the center of a clearing, were the Toddlers. Deathworld Toddlers. At first glance, they appeared harmless, small, playful creatures in the middle of the dangerous wilderness. But the crew knew better than to trust appearances. Each one of these small beings could rip apart any predator that dared to approach. Their speed, intelligence, and instincts were so honed that they had earned the title of the most dangerous creatures on this planet, bar none. "These are the ones we came for," Everhard murmured, her gaze fixed on the small group of toddlers as they played, seemingly unaware of the massive dangers lurking around them. Garth's heart pounded in his chest. The toddlers were laughing, but there was a coldness to the sound, an eerie, unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. They didn't act like children. They acted like apex predators, their small frames belying the raw power that lay just beneath the surface. The guide moved closer to them, and the group followed, their every step measured. As they drew nearer, the ground seemed to pulse once more, and the toddlers' eyes snapped to them, sharp and unblinking. They recognized the strangers, but rather than showing fear, their tiny faces twisted into expressions of curiosity, then challenge. "Stay close," Everhard instructed, her voice low. "We're not here to engage, just to observe." But as they approached the toddlers, an unexpected sound, a low growl, suddenly cut through the silence. Something large, something terrifying, was approaching. The ground vibrated with the heavy steps of a creature that could turn them all into dust in a matter of seconds. And just as they braced for impact, the toddlers took action. Without hesitation, they darted forward, moving faster than any human could. They surrounded the creature, their movements so fluid, so coordinated, that the crew couldn't even react in time. The creature, a massive, multi-limbed beast, roared in defiance, but it was quickly silenced by the toddlers, who worked together with an efficiency that would have put even the best-trained soldiers to shame. The toddlers had taken down the creature without a single scratch. They weren't just playing, they were hunting, surviving, and proving, once again, that they were the true apex predators of this world. The crew stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. These were not innocent children, they were lethal hunters, born to thrive in a world that would tear most beings apart. "Deathworld toddlers," Garth muttered, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "The most dangerous apex predators in the galaxy." And just like that, they understood. They weren't observing children, they were witnessing a phenomenon unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The most dangerous beings on the most dangerous world in the universe. As the crew stared in stunned silence at the scene before them, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The toddlers had taken down the massive, multi-limbed creature effortlessly, their movements swift and precise, an almost instinctual display of lethal coordination. It was an unsettling realization that the seemingly innocent beings before them were capable of slaughtering creatures far larger than themselves without a hint of hesitation. Lieutenant Garth took a step back, eyes wide. "Did they just kill that thing?" His voice cracked slightly as the adrenaline still coursed through his veins. Captain Everhard stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the toddlers. "I think we just witnessed something unprecedented," she murmured, her voice tinged with awe and apprehension. "They didn't just fight it off, they killed it in seconds." For a moment, the crew was frozen, unsure of how to proceed. The toddlers, oblivious to the impact of their actions on the humans around them, resumed their playful behavior as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. One of the smaller figures toddled over to the massive carcass of the creature they had just slain, poking at it with an inquisitive touch, its sharp little fingers easily cutting through the beast's hide. Gyrith, their guide, seemed unfazed. He watched the toddlers with a calm demeanor, as if this were all too normal. "This is how it is on Deathworld," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The young are born with the instincts to survive and the ability to protect themselves." He glanced at Everhart and the crew. "You humans call them toddlers, but they are already apex predators. They do not fear death, nor do they respect it. They simply exist in a way that no other species does." Garth clenched his jaw. "So we're here to observe these little monsters? Are we really supposed to study them?" Gyrith turned toward him, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. "You misunderstand. The Deathworlder young are not monsters. They are merely products of their environment. They survive because they must. If you are wise, you will learn from them, not judge them." Everhart raised a hand, signaling for the group to regroup. "Enough. Let's move forward." She knew better than to get lost in philosophical debates. They were here for a purpose, and that purpose had yet to be fully realized. The crew made their way deeper into the heart of the wilderness, following Gyrith's lead. The landscape seemed to shift around them as they moved, an ever-changing labyrinth of deadly terrain, thorn-covered plants, and hidden predators. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sounds of distant growls and screeches made every step feel like a walk on a razor's edge. The atmosphere was oppressive, as though the very planet itself was alive and aware of their presence, watching and judging every move. As they moved further into the jungle-like underbrush, the crew began to notice something peculiar. The toddlers were not only killing the massive creatures that roamed the planet, but they were also doing something else, something unsettling. They were communicating with each other in ways that humans could not understand. There was a sort of coordination, a synchrony, as they moved from one kill to the next. They didn't speak in words, at least not in any language the crew could comprehend, but their movements seemed to tell a story. One toddler would distract a creature, luring it in with calculated misdirection, while another would strike from behind. A third would use its superior speed to dart in for the final blow, incapacitating their target with an agility that left even the most seasoned warriors in awe. It was as if they had been raised by the planet itself to be perfect predators. And yet, in the midst of this violent dance, there was something disturbingly childlike about them. They didn't seem to have any concept of fear or pain. It was as if they were born knowing how to survive in the harshest conditions the universe could offer, and they carried out their tasks without any regard for the stakes. Captain Everhart couldn't help but marvel at their instincts, though a knot of unease twisted in her gut. "They're incredible," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "But also terrifying." Garth's eyes never left the toddlers. "I'm not sure I've ever seen anything like this. It's like they're machines. How can something so small be so deadly?" Gyrith didn't answer immediately. Instead, he led them to a clearing, the dense foliage parting to reveal a wide open space where several of the toddlers had gathered around a fallen creature. This time, it wasn't a massive beast, but a much smaller, though still dangerous, predator. The toddlers circled the creature, their tiny hands moving with startling precision as they dismantled it. They weren't simply killing it for sustenance, they were studying it. They pulled apart the creature's exoskeleton with ease, examining its inner workings as if they had done it 1,000 times before. It was a chilling sight to witness, small, innocent beings treating life and death with a calm efficiency that no human could match. "This is a critical moment," Everhart said, breaking the silence. "We need to learn everything we can. We've been sent here to understand them. If we don't figure this out, the consequences for humanity could be catastrophic." Garth nodded slowly, though his mind was elsewhere. The toddlers weren't just displaying physical prowess. They were also demonstrating an almost unnervingly high level of intelligence. They didn't need to be taught survival, they simply knew it. The question now wasn't whether or not they could survive on Deathworld. The question was how they could apply that knowledge, that instinct, to the greater universe. A low rumble shook the ground beneath them, and the crew instinctively readied themselves. The toddlers, however, didn't flinch. They didn't even look up. Instead, they continued to disassemble the creature in front of them as if the tremor was just a regular occurrence. It wasn't long before the source of the disturbance became apparent. Another massive creature, a hulking beast with 6 muscular legs and a series of sharp mandibles, emerged from the shadows. It was a predator, but this one wasn't just hunting. It was searching. And its target wasn't the toddlers, it was the crew. The ground beneath their feet shook again, and the creature's mandibles clicked together menacingly. It towered over the group, a savage force of nature, and it was clear that the crew would be its next meal. "Stay calm," Captain Everhart ordered. "We've trained for situations like this." But Garth's grip tightened around his weapon as the creature began to charge, its massive form quickly closing in on them. He could feel the heat radiating off its thick, armored skin, and his heart pounded in his chest. There was no way they could outrun this thing. They were outclassed, outmatched, and out of options. Then, just as the creature's jaws opened wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, the toddlers took action. In an instant they were upon the beast. The toddlers didn't hesitate. They moved as one, their coordinated attack quick and brutal. The creature roared in pain as the toddlers leapt onto its back, attacking with the precision of seasoned hunters. Within seconds, the creature was incapacitated, the toddlers once again proving that they were not just survivors of this brutal world, they were its masters. Everhart, Garth, and the rest of the crew stood frozen, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The toddlers had saved them. But the real question was, could they continue to rely on these young predators for their safety, or were they merely pawns in a much larger game? As the dust settled, Captain Everhart knew that the danger was far from over. They had come here to study these beings, but now it was clear, the toddlers of Deathworld were far more than just subjects of observation. They were the key to understanding the planet's deadly power, and perhaps, the key to humanity's survival in a galaxy full of predators. The real question now was, would the humans learn fast enough to keep up with their new, terrifying allies? The clearing where the massive predator had fallen was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves as the toddlers continued their dissection of the beast. Their tiny hands moved with unsettling precision, dissecting the creature as if they had done it 100 times before. The crew, still stunned by the toddler's ruthless efficiency, stood in a daze, weapons in hand but unsure whether to intervene. Captain Everhart stood at the forefront, her gaze never leaving the small figures. It was clear now, these toddlers were far beyond anything she had ever encountered. They were not merely survivors of Deathworld, they were its rulers. The very idea that something so young, so innocent in appearance, could hold such power was mind-boggling. "How do we survive here?" Garth muttered, still staring at the toddlers. "How do we deal with creatures like that, let alone them?" Everhart's mind raced as she tried to formulate a plan. "We don't fight them," she said quietly. "We adapt. We learn." Her voice, steady and calm, masked the tension gnawing at her insides. The reality of their situation was clear. They were far from the apex predators here. The toddlers, as disturbing as it was to admit, were the true hunters. But they were still human, and they still had their strengths. They had intelligence, cunning, and the ability to form alliances. Gyrith, who had been observing the toddlers, finally spoke up. "You are not prepared for what's coming. You've seen a glimpse of the raw power these young ones possess, but you've only scratched the surface. Deathworld is not a place for the weak of heart." Everhart's gaze turned to Gyrith. The tall alien seemed calm, almost detached, as if this was just another day in the life of a native to this brutal world. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that almost resembled fear. "What's coming?" Everhart asked, her voice sharp. Gyrith hesitated, then slowly nodded toward the horizon, where the dense jungle stretched out endlessly. "The adults. They are the true apex predators. And they are always watching." A heavy silence fell over the group as the gravity of Gyrith's words settled in. The toddlers, impressive as they were only one aspect of Deathworld's deadly ecosystem. The true dangers were still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the crew moved forward, their progress slowed. They couldn't help but feel the weight of Gyratha's warning. The jungle seemed to close in on them, its oppressive heat and humidity pressing down with each step. The dense foliage whispered with the sounds of unseen creatures, their eyes always on the humans. The toddlers, however, seemed utterly unaffected by the environment. They scampered ahead, their small bodies moving with ease through the treacherous terrain. It was as if the jungle itself was a playground to them, a place where they ruled without challenge. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere grew heavier. It wasn't just the jungle that was watching them, it was something else. A primal sense of unease hung in the air, thickening with every step. The sound of growls echoed through the trees, sending ripples of tension through the crew. Suddenly, one of the toddlers stopped, its small head cocked to one side. Its eyes, wide and sharp, scanned the jungle, sensing something before anyone else did. The toddler's tiny hands began to twitch, and without warning, it dashed forward, faster than any human could react. "Wait!" Everhart called, but it was too late. The toddler had already disappeared into the thick underbrush. "What are you doing?" Garth shouted, his voice full of panic. "We can't just let them run off like that." But the toddler wasn't running blindly. It had detected something, and it was acting on instinct. The crew was frozen, unsure whether to follow or stay put. They had just witnessed the toddlers take down a creature 10 times their size. But now they were confronted with a new fear. What if this time, the predator was too much for even them? A roar shattered the tense silence, sending a shockwave of fear through the group. The ground trembled beneath their feet as something massive moved in the distance. The toddlers, seemingly undeterred by the sound, continued their path forward, each one instinctively moving closer together. Garth was the first to react. "We have to move, now!" Without waiting for the others, he pushed through the brush, following the trail the toddlers had left behind. His mind was racing, but a part of him knew that they had no choice but to follow the toddlers if they wanted to survive. Their ability to navigate this world was beyond anything the crew could match. As they plunged deeper into the jungle, the growls grew louder. The presence of the predator was undeniable, and the crew felt the weight of their situation settling in. They were no longer in control of their fate. The planet had claimed them, and it was up to the toddlers to show them the way. The encounter came quickly. The toddlers had stopped, and now the crew could see it too. A towering beast, its body covered in thick, armored plating, emerged from the shadows. It was massive, easily 5 meters tall, and its jaws were lined with rows of deadly teeth. The creature's eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light as it surveyed the area. The toddlers, undeterred by the creature's intimidating presence, began to move forward, each of them making a distinct, calculated move. They were not running in fear. They were hunting. The crew was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. They had no weapon capable of matching the creature's sheer power. But as they watched the toddlers, something remarkable happened. The small figures didn't hesitate, they attacked. One of the toddlers darted forward, leaping high into the air and landing on the creature's back. With a precision that only a true predator could possess, it dug its sharp fingers into the creature's armor, finding weak spots where the plating was thinner. The other toddlers quickly followed suit, working together with eerie synchrony. The beast howled in pain as the toddlers continued to assault it from all angles. It tried to thrash, but the small, agile creatures were too quick, too relentless. The fight was over in mere moments. The crew stood in stunned silence as the beast collapsed to the ground dead. The toddlers climbed off the creature's body as if nothing had happened, moving on as if they had simply completed another task in their unending mission of survival. Garth's mind raced, still processing what he had witnessed. The toddlers were not just powerful, they were unmatched. They didn't just survive Deathworld. They dominated it. Everhart turned to Gyrath, her face pale. "Are you telling me that these children have the ability to defeat that thing every time?" Gyrath nodded solemnly. "They don't just defeat it. They thrive here. And the adults..." He trailed off, his eyes scanning the horizon, his expression unreadable. "The adults are even more dangerous." The crew stood there, a mix of awe and fear gripping them. They had come to learn about the toddlers, but what they had witnessed was far more than just survival. They had witnessed the mastery of a species at the peak of its evolutionary potential. The toddlers of Deathworld were not just apex predators, they were an entire generation of warriors, born to rule this planet. And if they were to have any chance of surviving, the crew would need to learn from them, or risk becoming part of the food chain. The sky above Deathworld was a deep shade of crimson as the crew of the expeditionary team gathered in a small, temporary shelter, constructed hastily after the chaos of the previous days. The landscape outside was still chaotic, a landscape where every step could lead to an encounter with a predator or worse. But inside the shelter, for the first time in what felt like forever, the humans had a brief moment of respite. Captain Everhart sat on the ground, her back against the shelter's hard wall. Her eyes, though tired, were still sharp. Her team had come here to observe, to study the extraordinary and, frankly, terrifying creatures of this brutal world. But what they had encountered, what they had survived, had shaken her to her core. The toddlers, who had once seemed like curious anomalies, were now the stuff of nightmares. Yet, in the midst of this terror, there was something more. Something she hadn't expected to find. Garth sat across from her, lost in thought. He had seen the toddlers at work, had watched them dismantle beasts that could have easily crushed him, and a part of him still couldn't believe what he had witnessed. "We're not just observing them, are we?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. "We're learning from them." Everhart's gaze turned to him, her face showing the weight of the past few days. "We don't have a choice. If we're going to survive this place, we need to adapt. And I think they can teach us how." The toddlers, now sitting on the ground outside the shelter, were playing in the dirt, seemingly carefree. To an outside observer, they might have looked like typical children, innocent and unassuming. But to those who had seen them fight, who had watched them kill without hesitation, the image was distorted. The innocence was still there, but so was the deadly focus. The understanding that survival was everything. That weakness was not an option. "We've seen it," Everhart continued, her voice firm. "They are not just survivors. They are teaching us a lesson we didn't want to learn." Garth exhaled slowly. "Survival of the fittest," he muttered, his mind still racing. "But it's not just survival. It's dominance. They don't just fight. They control. They manipulate. They dominate this world." Everhart nodded, the gravity of his words sinking in. Deathworld was a planet where the law of the jungle had evolved into something far more refined, more terrifying. It was not enough to merely survive. One had to control, manipulate, and dominate, because if you didn't, you were a corpse. "But how do we learn that?" Garth asked, glancing at the toddlers outside. Gyrith, who had been standing at the edge of the shelter, stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested deep knowledge, wisdom born from years spent on this savage world. "By watching them," Gyrith said, his voice low. "By following their lead." The crew exchanged skeptical glances. They had seen the toddlers' incredible abilities, but could they truly learn from them? Could they emulate the same kind of ruthless efficiency that these tiny creatures exhibited in their every action? Gyrith continued. "Deathworld is not a place where you wait for things to happen. You make them happen. The toddlers understand this. They have no fear, no hesitation. They do not question their actions. They do not question their place in this world. They simply act, and the world bends to their will." Everhart turned to Gyrith, her face hardening. "You want us to become like them?" Gyrith's eyes narrowed slightly. "I do not want you to become like them. I want you to survive. And if that means learning to think like them, then that is the path you must take. You must shed your weakness, your human doubt. Here, that will be your death." The words hit hard, but Everhart knew that Gyrith was right. They had come to this planet expecting to study the toddlers, but the real lesson had been the one Deathworld was teaching them. The toddlers didn't just exist, they thrived. They didn't simply fight, they controlled their environment. They were, as terrifying as it was to admit, the true apex predators of this world. And if the crew didn't learn how to think like them, they wouldn't survive. The decision came after several sleepless nights. The crew gathered, their faces grim but determined. They had seen enough. They had been thrown into the deep end of Deathworld's deadly ecosystem, and they had to either learn to swim or sink. Everhart addressed her team, her tone resolute. "We're going to change the way we approach this world. We can't keep waiting for something to save us. We have to become part of this world. We need to think like they do. We need to learn to use this planet, not fear it." She turned to Gyrith, who stood at the back of the group. "We need to know everything we can about the adults. We've seen what the toddlers can do, but we need to understand what makes them so strong. What makes them so deadly." Gyrith's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You've made the right choice," he said. "I will show you. But you must listen. Deathworld does not forgive those who are weak." With Gyrith as their guide, the crew began their new path, an unorthodox journey to embrace the savage methods of survival that the toddlers exemplified. They studied their movements, their instincts, the way they navigated the landscape with fearlessness, never second-guessing themselves. Every interaction with the environment was a lesson. Every step, a calculated risk. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about understanding the patterns of the world around them, recognizing when to fight, when to wait, when to manipulate the terrain, and when to retreat. And perhaps most importantly, it was about shedding their humanity, letting go of the things that made them different from the predators of Deathworld. At first, the lessons were difficult. The humans struggled to adapt to the brutal realities of their new life. The toddlers seemed to have a natural understanding of the planet's every danger, while the humans were constantly on edge, second-guessing themselves. But over time, they began to get it. They learned to think like predators, ruthless, opportunistic, and above all, adaptive. The crew moved in unison, a new synchronization forming between them. They learned to stop questioning their decisions, stop doubting their instincts. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The more they observed the toddlers, the more they realized that their small size was not a limitation. They were powerful because they had no fear, no hesitation. They were willing to do whatever it took to survive, to dominate, to bend the world to their will. Then, the inevitable happened. The adults arrived. The sight of the towering predators was unlike anything the crew had ever seen. Massive creatures, fully grown and adorned with armor-like plating that glimmered in the faint light, their eyes glowing with an unsettling intelligence. They were a sight to behold, beautiful in their sheer power, but terrifying in their potential. But this time, the crew didn't hesitate. They didn't panic. They didn't second-guess themselves. They moved swiftly, like the toddlers before them. They fought with the same cold efficiency, the same coordination, the same understanding of how to use the terrain to their advantage. They were no longer passive observers. They were active participants in the savage dance of survival. The battle was intense, but this time, the crew was ready. They fought with the same ruthless precision, using their surroundings to their advantage, exploiting weaknesses, and using every lesson they had learned from the toddlers. When the battle was over, the crew stood victorious. They had defeated the adults. But more than that, they had survived. And as they looked at the corpses of the massive predators around them, a realization washed over them. They had become part of Deathworld, not just as survivors, but as its new rulers. They had shed their humanity, embraced the instincts that the toddlers had taught them, and in doing so, they had conquered the planet. Captain Everhart stood tall, breathing heavily but with a fierce sense of pride in her chest. "We've learned the hardest lesson of all," she said quietly. "That survival isn't enough. You have to rule. You have to control. And we've learned how to do that." Garth nodded slowly, a grim smile crossing his face. "I think we're ready for whatever comes next." And as the crew looked out across the expanse of Deathworld, they understood. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. They were the apex predators now.